Do I regret switching to an M1 Mac? This has been the question that has been on the top of my head ever since watching one of Rene Ritchie's latest videos in which he goes over why he is still using an Intel-based 16-inch MacBook Pro and the reasons why he didn't switch over to the latest M1 Macs. And he goes over a ton of reasons in his video about why he still uses Intel and also the benefits of the M1 platform. And to be fair, he also mentions how excited he is for the next generation of the M1X computers. But it just had me thinking overall in these past few months that I have been using M1 Macs, do I actually regret my decision switching over early with some of the advantages that Intel-based Macs still have? Now, this isn't like a reaction to Rene's video. It's not even a beef video if you were expecting that. I actually love Rene's content, and if you haven't watched one of his videos, you should, because honestly, he makes better content than me. So if you haven't seen his video yet, I will leave a link in the description below. But basically, he went over a ton of points of why he is still using Intel-based Macs in his video. I'm gonna do my best to summarize those points before I start talking about how I feel about them. And a lot of these points, or basically all these points, are extremely valid because Intel Macs do have a lot of advantages right now. One of those being, there is a lot more diversity in the Intel Mac lineup right now. If you're buying an M1 computer, you're really limited to an M1 Mac Mini or just the entry-level MacBook Air or MacBook Pro. So you really don't get a lot of options here in terms of display sizes or even in terms of desktop-based Macs. With Intel, you still have the Mac Mini, the space gray version. You still have a 13-inch MacBook Pro, and then you get options for bigger screen sizes. So you can get the 16-inch MacBook Pro. If you want an all-in-one desktop, well, you have options there, and you can get even bigger displays with the 21-inch iMac or even the big 27-inch iMac. And then if you're a crazy person, or you just have a lot of money to spend, you can even get a full desktop tower with the $6,000 Mac Pro. And then if you're super crazy, you can get a Apple Pro display. Well, I guess you can use that on the M1 Mac, so I probably shouldn't list that here. But it just seemed fitting to pair that along with the Mac Pro. Who's buying a MacBook Air with a Pro Display XDR? If you did, I would love to meet you, so let me know in the comments below. But anyway, I think you get my point. There is more diversity, more versatility in the Intel lineup of Macs right now, and that versatility also extends to things like the port selection. So on the M1 MacBooks, you are severely limited in your port options right now, with both the Air and the Pro only having 2 USB 4 ports. So if you look over at the Intel line of laptops, they all have 4 USB 3 ports, and that's double the port selection, and you can actually charge on either side of the device. So that's a really nice feature to have. Even if you look at something like the M1 Mac Mini, which does have a decent port selection with 2 USB-A ports, 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, an HDMI port, and Ethernet port. Those are great, but if you compare it to the Mac Mini that's running on Intel right now, you'll notice that that system has a much bigger port selection. Even though they're both Mac Minis, the Intel Mac wins out on the port selection. And then there's other problems that these M1 Macs have. The ability that they can only drive one external display at a time is a big limitation. Now, on the Mac Mini, you can drive 2 displays at once using the HDMI cord and then using a Thunderbolt cable. But if you compare it to something like the Intel Mac Mini again, you can just drive more displays than what you can on the M1 right now. So there's display limitations on the M1 platform as well. You're also limited in the amount of storage and memory you can configure on these machines. So all of the M1 Macs max out at 2 terabytes of storage and 16 gigabytes of unified memory, where Intel-based Macs, you can go all the way up to 8 terabytes of storage. And then for memory configurations, if you're comparing something like the 13-inch MacBook Pro, you can get 32 gigabytes of RAM. And then if you go up to like a 16-inch MacBook Pro, you can get 64 gigabytes of RAM. I believe on the latest iMacs, you can go all the way up to 128 gigabytes of RAM. And then if you're on like the Mac Pro, you can just basically max it out with like 1.5 terabytes of RAM. I don't know who needs 1.5 terabytes of RAM, but you know what? If you want it, You can do it on an Intel Mac Pro. You can't do it on the M1 Max. You're limited to just 16 gigabytes. And then there's graphics capabilities. Listen, I have sung the praises of the M1's CPU power, and rightfully so. The M1 MacBook Air is outscoring things like a 16-inch MacBook Pro in CPU power. It's really impressive. On the graphics front, it's a different story. Now, don't get me wrong, for integrated graphics, the M1 is impressive, but you have to consider that the machines that Apple still has that are running on Intel, a lot of them are still using dedicated graphics cards, and no matter how good the integrated card is on the M1, it still isn't comparable to some of the options you can get when you go with a discrete GPU in products like the 16-inch MacBook Pro, the iMac, and the Mac Pro. And not only do those enhanced graphics extend over into Pro applications, but they're also a lot better for gaming. And yes, I know you're thinking, well, if you're using a Mac, you're not gaming anyway. Another big benefit that these Intel-based Macs have is that you can still boot camp into Windows to play a huge selection of games. And if you're using one of those higher end systems, even though they're a lot of money and they might not be the best gaming laptops out there, far from it, you can still play a lot of these games at high resolutions and high FPS if you boot camp over into Windows. So these Intel Macs do have a lot of advantages right now. And when you're missing those features and you're only using an M1 Mac, those are all legitimate pain points. Those are all pain points I even acknowledged in my reviews of all of these M1 products. Now for me, I decided to switch over to the M1 Macs ever since they first came out. If you've watched any of my previous videos on this, you know that I had like a $4,000 spec'd out iMac, and my MacBook Air, my MacBook Pro, and the Mac Mini were all exporting Final Cut footage faster than what that really expensive iMac could at a fraction of the price. Like half the price for the MacBook Pro, a fourth of the price for the MacBook Air, and like what? Like a 1/6 or 1/8 cost for the Mac Mini? Like really ridiculous stuff here. So I decided to switch over to the M1 platform. I got rid of my iMac, or I still have my iMac, I just don't use it, it's collecting dust, and my 16-inch MacBook Pro. Because while there are a lot of pain points with dealing with the M1 Macs, I've kind of found workarounds or solutions for all of them, and to me right now, the benefits of the M1 Macs far outweigh the negatives. So when I'm looking at the port situation on the M1 Max, I can solve those issues with things like an adapter or a dock. So with my Anchor adapter, I plug that into the side and all of a sudden I have two USB-A ports, two USB-C ports, an SD card and micro SD card and an HDMI slot. So even ports that I wasn't originally getting on my MacBook are all instantly brought back to me. I can also connect a dock as well. So I have an Anchor dock, it plugs over one USB 4 cable, and then I get a even bigger selection of ports when I'm using my MacBook Pro in desktop mode. The smaller display size of moving from a 16-inch to a 13-inch MacBook Pro was a legitimate problem, and there's still a lot of problems I have when I'm doing color grading in Final Cut Pro. If I'm looking at my scopes or my graphs, they're really tiny, they're really small, it's kind of hard to pinpoint certain things, even if you blow up Final Cut and put it full screen on a 13-inch laptop. So there's still things that I would want with a future M1X Mac, like a bigger display size potentially. But I do also have the option to take that MacBook Pro and hook it up to an external display. Now, I know I can only hook up one external display at a time, like we talked about before, but something like a 27-inch 5K display, that is enough for me. Just one of those displays is perfectly fine. And then when I'm doing most of my work on the M1 Mac, even if I want it to be portable, I can still do that on the smaller screen. And then I have all the advantages of using like a bigger screen 27-inch iMac just by plugging it into a 5K display. So even something like the external display limitations haven't been an issue for me, or they've been an issue, but not a big one, not big enough to decide to stick with Intel. As for storage, I was never getting the 8 terabyte versions of any of these Macs, even when they were on Intel. And I was honestly getting a lot less than I even got on my current M1 MacBook Pro, with my last 27-inch iMac only having 512 gigabytes of internal storage. So for me, the M1 MacBook Pro has been an upgrade because I put a 1 terabyte drive in that. And then with my Mac Mini, I still have a 512 gigabyte drive, which was the same as my iMac. So I can get that the internal storage, for some people, if they want it, storage tiers of 4 or 8 terabytes, could be problematic. But for me, ignorance is bliss. There's also the RAM constraints, which should have been a legitimate reason why I couldn't have switched to these M1 Macs. On my previous iMac, I had 40 gigabytes of RAM in there, and on my 16-inch MacBook Pro, I had a 32 gigabyte RAM configuration. So when I first went over to these M1 Macs, I was really worried that 16 gigabytes wouldn't be able to cut it. And to my delightful surprise, they work tremendously well on just 16 gigabytes of memory. So much so, in fact, that I believe my M1 MacBook Pro with 16 gigabytes of memory has less hangups and less slowdowns than my old 40 gigabyte iMac. So that's saying something here. So even though there is a limitation in memory size, and depending on your work, everyone's work is different, maybe it will affect you. But for me, I found that these M1 machines running at half the memory ran better than my previous Intel Macs. And you know what? The graphics are fine. Okay, they're not fine. Well, they're fine for integrated graphics. If you're switching from an older MacBook Pro or like a smaller 13-inch version that used Intel integrated graphics, the M1 has better integrated graphics. But I wasn't using any of those machines. I was using a 16-inch MacBook Pro or an iMac, which had dedicated graphics cards. So having less graphics capability is a setback for me, although I don't really notice it in applications like Final Cut Pro. But I do notice it in gaming, and I'm not really doing much gaming on my M1 Macs, and I really couldn't if I wanted to, because when I did game on my Mac, I would boot camp into Windows, and that just isn't an option on these M1 Macs. So that is a legitimate complaint, but again, not enough of a reason for me to still keep using an Intel-based Mac. Now, I talked about the reasons why I can use an M1 Mac or some of the workarounds I use to make the M1 Macs work, but I really didn't tout any of the benefits of the M1 platform. And that's really the reason why I decided to stick with using the M1 MacBook Pro and Mac Mini. And that's just how great the M1 chip is on multiple fronts. So number one, the power. Like, the power of the M1 is literally insane when you consider how fast it is and the form factors that it's been put into. So if you're looking at even like the base model MacBook Air, the CPU in that outscores things like the 16-inch MacBook Pro. It outscored things like my 27-inch iMac in real-world export tests. So the CPU here is just amazingly powerful, especially when you consider that these are entry-level computers. These should not be outscoring Apple's best Intel Macs, and somehow they are. In CPU power, they absolutely are destroying those higher-end Macs. So these were a great replacement for the entry-level line, and they're also a great replacement even at the higher end. And it's more than just, generic benchmarks or Final Cut export tests in terms of power. It's also just the general responsiveness of the user interface on the M1. So for example, if you have like apps in your dock and you go to click on them, if it's optimized for the M1 chip, that app will load almost instantly or just bounce like 1 or 2 times. Where sometimes on Intel Macs, you'd go to click on an app like Final Cut, and you would just have it bouncing up and down in the dock like multiple times before it opened. So the general user interface is really snappy on the M1. And even waking up the computer from sleep, especially on these laptops where you just lift the lid, the screen instantly turns on with the newer Macs. And forget power, there's also the thermals. So these CPUs, like I mentioned before, are more powerful than computers like the 16-inch MacBook Pro in some cases, and these chips also run significantly cooler. The thermals on any of these Macs are just bonkers. So let's take a look at the M1 MacBook Air. It literally doesn't have a fan in it. It is silent. You can't get it to make a sound if you want it to. And all this time with no fan in it, it runs cooler than any of the Intel Macs that I have ever tested that have fans inside of them. If you took a direct comparison against the Intel MacBook Air and put it up against the M1 MacBook Air, the Intel MacBook Air can get super hot when it's exporting video, while the M1 MacBook Air can maybe get a little bit warm. If you look at something with an active cooling system like the MacBook Pro or the Mac Mini, the fans are pretty much virtually silent. So even though I'm saying the M1 MacBook Air is great because it doesn't have a fan, you won't hear it, even on the systems that do have a fan, it's so rare that you actually hear them spin up. And when they do spin up, it's just for a short period of time, and maybe it's like a little silent hum, like you'd have to put your ear up to the laptop or the Mac Mini to actually hear these things going. So you can actually use these laptops as laptops. I remember one time I was using like a 2020 Intel-based MacBook Pro with a 4-port model, and the bottom of that machine got so hot, even when like running like everyday apps sometimes, it would like scorch my legs when I was using that computer. So that is just a thing of the past on the M1 machines. They never get hot. I don't think they ever really even get warm, and even the machines that have a fan, they're so silent, especially when you're comparing them to Intel-based MacBook Pros. Like if you try and render a video on a 13-inch MacBook Pro, you are just gonna hear the equivalent of jet engines like in your room. It is really loud, really annoying, and if you switch to the M1, nothing. Silent, a thing of the past. And then battery life. So all of this thermal efficiency is because these chips are running at much lower wattages compared to the Intel equivalent. And that also means that they are significantly better at using energy, which means they're more efficient in battery life. So something like the MacBook Pro gets a jump in battery life to up to 20 hours on the M1 MacBook Pro. And the MacBook Air gets 18 hours of battery life. So that is just insane, true all-day battery life. And even if you used your MacBook in the past and you're like, oh, I never really had to worry about battery life too much, I just charged it at the end of the day. Well, I'm telling you that these M1 Macs are just even better than that. So if you're going out somewhere, you don't even think to pack along your charging cable with you. You know that if that MacBook is fully charged, it is going to last you throughout the entire day, no matter what you throw at it. And that includes things like video editing. I remember when I was using Intel Macs, even if I could get 10 hours of battery life with wireless web browsing or watching video, the minute I would load up Final Cut on that machine, I would be limited to like 2 to 3 hours of battery life max, where on the M1 Macs, I haven't done like a test, draining it to completely zero video editing, but there's been plenty of times where I am video editing without a power cord, and I can edit an entire video, where on the Intel machines, like halfway through my video editing, I would have to make sure to find a power outlet and plug my Mac in, or else I wouldn't be able to finish that video project. With the M1 Macs, even though it does drain battery faster when you're video editing, it literally hasn't been a problem. I can edit my videos, not have to worry about plugging into power, and actually finish a fully edited video, and that's awesome. Like, that's just power you can't buy. That is just an excellent feature that is kind of, life-changing. I hate to use that term, it's not really life-changing, but it's life-changing in the way that you would use a laptop. And all of those benefits of the M1 coming together with the CPU power, the thermals, the efficiency, the battery life, all of that stuff just make a fantastic computer. And again, these are the entry-level computers, so you're really getting a nice value here. Now, I want to get back to the original question I posed at the beginning of this video, and that was, do I regret switching over to the M1 Macs? And the answer is honestly no. I do not regret switching over. I have been using the M1 Macs ever since they've been released, and yes, while they do have shortcomings and while there are still advantages to being on an Intel Mac, I wouldn't trade any of those advantages for what I have now with the M1 Mac. I could never see myself going back to using an Intel-based Mac. I just wouldn't want to do it. The benefits of the M1 outweigh all of the disadvantages, for me at least, that Intel has to offer. So no, I don't regret switching to the M1 Macs. I would do it again and again and again. I love the M1 Macs, and I can't wait to see what they do next with the next generation. But anyway, that's what I think about the M1 Macs and why I don't regret switching to them. Please let me know in the comments below. Have you bought an M1 Mac? Have you switched over from an Intel-based Mac? And how are you liking the experience so far? Or are you the opposite of me and right now you just can't switch over to the M1 even despite the benefits because of some of the advantages that Intel Macs still legitimately do have? As always, if you like this video, be sure to give me a like. If you want to see more from my channel, make sure you're subscribed. If you want to help the channel out in any way, like maybe I convinced you to buy an M1 Mac, well, check out some of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. Take care, everyone.